Greetings tonight, my Gavanin. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight we are going to talk all about Dark Elves. I'm very excited about this. I've been wanting to do this video for a while, but everything in time, right? So we are going to talk about some dark things, but you may realize that the darkest fairies symbolize something for humanity, and there's a reason for these fairies to appear in fairy tales and folklore. Those that identify themselves as dark elves may resonate with some of the characteristics that I talk about tonight. And I'm going to start off with an introduction from Brian Froud in his book on bad fairies and good fairies. Although people nowadays tend to think of fairies as gentle little sprites, anyone who has encountered fairies knows they can be tricksy, capricious, and even dangerous. Our ancestors certainly knew this. Folklore is filled with cautionary tales about the perils of fairy encounters, and in centuries past there were many places where people did not dare to go a-hunting for fear of little men. The idea that the world is full of spirit beings, both good and bad, is one we find in the oldest myths and tales from cultures the world over. In ancient Greece, the Neoplatonists Porphyry from 232 C or 305 AD wrote that the air was inhabited by good and bad spirits with fluid bodies of no fixed shape, creatures who would change their form at will. These were certainly fairies. Porphyry explains that the bad spirits were composed of turbulent malady and created disruptions whenever humans failed to address them with respect. The Romans acknowledged the presence of fairy spirits called lares, who, when venerated properly at the hearth, the heart of the household, protected the home and family. The Lares were ruled over by their mother, Laronda, an earth goddess and fairy queen. The Roman boogeymen were the lemures, dark spirits of the night. They had all the traits of bad fairies and had to be placated by throwing back beans at them while turning one's head away. In Northern Europe, the maggots emerging from the dead body of the giant Ymir transmuted into light and dark elves. Light elves inhabiting the air and dark elves dwelling in the earth. Persian fairies, known as the Peri, were creatures formed of the element of fire, existing on a diet of perfume and other exquisite odors. The bad fairies of Persia, called the Dev, were forever at war with the Peri, whom they captured and locked away in iron cages hanging high in trees. Other fairy creatures, both benevolent and malign, appear in tales from many far-flung lands. The Lamanic of Basque folklore, the Grama Devata of India, the Jinn of Arabia, the Hessian of China, the Yumbos of West Africa, the Underhill people of the Cherokee, and numerous other spirits who have both plagued and aided humankind since the world began. In the early 17th century, a certain Dr. Jackson held the view that good and bad fairies are simply two sides of the same coin. Thus are the fairies, from difference of events ascribed to them, divided into good and bad, when it is by one and the same malignant fiend that meddled in both, seeking sometimes to be feared, other whiles to be loved. An English text from the 16th century states that there be three kinds of fairies, the black, the white, and the green, of which the black be the worst. And although in Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor, another group of fairies was added, fairies black, gray, green, and white, with little indication as to their nature. In old Scotland, there was no doubt that there were only two groups of fairies, the guide fairies and the wicked ones. In the former category was the Seelie court, the good or blessed court that helped guide. A host of fairies who were benefactors to humans, giving bread, seeds, and comfort to the needy. These fairies might give secret helping and threshing, weaving, and household chores, and were generally kind, but they were strict in their demands for appropriate reparation. The Unseelie court, by contrast, were fearsome creatures, inflicting various harms and ills on man and beast alike. In the fairy faith in Celtic countries, in 1911, the American folklorist W.Y. Evans Wentz asserted that the fairy race had the power to destroy half the human race, yet refrained from doing so out of ethical considerations. Lady Gregory, the Irish folklorist, playwright, and patron of W.B. Yeats, held the fairies in rather less awe. She claimed they were merely capricious and mischievous, like unruly children. In modern life, we are not free from the plagues and torments of bad fairies. They make their presence known to us through all manner of disruptions, from minor daily irritations to serious problems affecting our health and well-being. Among the minor fairy mischief makers are ones we're all familiar with: the snagger, whose sharp claws attack women's stockings before they leave the house; the various spotters and stainers who leave the grubby evidence of their manifestation on a freshly laundered blouse or tie, usually right before that important business meeting; the sneaker, who always waits until Monday morning when the kids are late for the bus to silently sneak away with a shoe. We've all had personal tongue tanglers and sudden stark panics and gloomy dooms and moments when afterward we would say, "Good heavens, whatever possessed me?" The fairies have possessed you, tangling your words, your thoughts, your feet, or your fate. These capricious creatures have been known as fairies, fairishers, ferrymen, and fairies, a whole race of beings known to block potential and clarity of thought. They hide behind tiny irritations and lurk within our daily disasters. In more serious guise, they're the fairy blights, whose touch can cause depression, addictions, compulsions, and moments of dark despair. It is the nature of fairies to be unruly, chaotic, disruptive, subversive, confusing, ambivalent, paradoxical, and downright frustrating. Yet even these bad interferences serve an important function. They remind us of the value of connection, wholeness, and openness by holding a mirror up to us and showing us the opposite. Bad fairies, from the small stock stealers to the larger creatures of gloom and doom, are, like all fairies, expressions of nature and of our own deepest selves. They are manifestations of psychic blocks, distortions, and unresolved emotions. They give form and personality to negative forces and abstractions. They nip and prod us, asking for simple acknowledgement of their presence in our lives, insisting that we take notice of them, the first step to healing or change. It cannot be denied that sickness, madness, and even death have been reported in many old tales concerning encounters with the shadow side of fairyland. Yet the same fairies have also been known to give gifts, guidance, and aid to the needy, and to heal mortals of illnesses both physical and psychological. I believe no fairy is completely good or bad, but fluidly embodies both extremes. Any fairy can be either one or the other in his or her equivocal relationship with us. They change with circumstance, with whim, and with motivations far beyond our human mind. Their actions and reactions generally work towards engaging us at deeper and deeper levels of consciousness, insisting we be conscious of them, of ourselves, and of the world around us. They can become quite angry and disruptive if we're not awake and paying attention, particularly if they feel they've not been properly acknowledged. The bad fairy is the story Sleeping Beauty. In one example, she is angry because she has been neglected, overlooked at the christening feast. Yet her wickedness initiates the events that lead to the princess's final transformation. Could this have been her intent all along? Beyond the guise of wickedness, when dealing with the fairies, it is wise to remember that things aren't always as they first appear. What seems to be bad behavior might have a deeper, underlying reason. Despite our tendency to split the world into good and bad, right and wrong, light and dark, We must remember that in truth and in the fairy realm, such divisions are not always cleanly cut. Each contains a piece of the other, holding the world in tension and balance. And the shape-shifting denizens of fairy can appear wearing either face. So that's what Brian Froud had to say. And that's what I would like you to keep in mind as we go through this, that dark elves are bad fairies in that idea, darker fairies, if you want to say. He called them the bad fairies. They exist in order to teach humanity a lesson, one that is very much needed. And so the dark elves exist as guardians of nature, and we will talk more about what they represent in lots of different types of stories and in the way that they appear in fantasy. And before I go on, I wanted to read you The Queen of the Bad Fairies by Brian Froud. Here in the light of the waning moon is the Queen of the Bad Fairies, in charge of all Fae. In Scotland, she is known as Nienna, an elf queen of the Unseelie court. In Germany, she's Berchta, leading the savage dogs of the wild hunt. In Spain, she is the queen of Estanguea, the ancient host of spirits, telling all she meets, travel by day, for the night belongs to me. Her domain is the night. She rules over dusk and darkness, shadows and shades. The Dark Queen's power emanates from the dark side of the moon. Much is secret and hidden here, cloaked by dark and illusion. An Irish banshee wails her death song, echoed by La Llorona, her baleful cousin in the American West. Black Annis, the wretched blue-faced hag, sits and grinds her long white teeth. Hobgoblins and bogles torment the ghostly black dogs who haunt dark country lanes. The human dead are ambassadors to the court of this dark fairy queen. For the mounds that fairies inhabit were burial mounds in centuries past. But every shroud has a silver lining. All things must die to be reborn. The transformative power of fairy turns muck into magic, dross into shining gold, and black despair into crystalline joy. Just as life grows out of death, good can grow from those things we call bad. The banshee cry foretells change, not death. Blue-faced hags, if we pass the test and embrace them, turn into beautiful women. Or perhaps it's not the hags who change, but merely our vision of them. In Irish folklore, hags were once revered as powerful wise women, credited with building the ancient cairns and Ireland's sacred mountains. In the darkness, the seeds of good germinate, unfold, grow upward towards the light. Fairyland is a land of paradox. In light, there is darkness. In darkness, light. You will find no absolute evil here within the Dark Queen's realm, for she is a queen of nature, a force of nature, formed from the dreaming earth. True evil exists only in the shadow of man when he turns his back to the light. So the reason why I wanted to read that to you was because whenever on my channel I have ever talked about darkness, spiritual darkness, it's coming from my observations of humanity and even within myself, being part of this collective and understanding that there's darkness in all of us. Spiritual darkness of humans that have hurt one another and have caused great despair to each other is a little bit different, I would say much different, than the darkness of fairies. The reason is because all elementals, regardless if they're dark or light, are connected to nature. Brian Froud knew this, I knew this intuitively. So nature is the holding place of the light, so that there is some light that exists within all dark fairies, within all dark elves. And if you know how to find that light, you can always make a friend. So you always can start to understand that nature is the bridge between both the dark fairies and the light fairies. And humans that have come in between with their destructive ways towards nature has caused the division, created the Unseelie and Seelie court themselves. It is only the human ignorance that has caused those courts and those fairies to divide themselves. The reason is because at one time, when humans started to spread on Earth, taking over the lands, destroying the forests, not caring who they hurt or what animals they hunted in excess, it caused a schism within the realm of fairy. You had some fairies that decided to see humans as ignorant, younger beings in not understanding nature and their connection to it. So they took it upon themselves to be the teachers to humans, to teach them that nature connection. And so then you had druids, and you had the Wiccans and the pagan types of religions that were born from this type of passing down wisdom from the Fae folk that were hidden. Then you had the other fairies, the ones that divided themselves against humans because they saw them as only enemies. They could not see them as ever learning and ever being friends. So it was human ignorance, a disconnect from nature, that actually created the fairy courts and the division that you see. So keeping that in mind, you can understand why they exist. That evil does not exist for no reason at all. It is all a learning tool and a learning experience for all of us. So that was Brian Froud, and he's a great person to get more information about fairies in general. I wanted to share with you a personal past life incarnation, because I will tell the world today that I too have awakened to remember that I was also, at least one lifetime, and maybe even many, I was part of the Unseelie court. And it has taken me many lifetimes to transform into a Seelie court being. It took a lot of work to see the goodness in humanity, to see the hope. So I want to share with you a past life incarnation to give you a glimpse inside of the Unseelie mind. I remember at least one lifetime, and perhaps many, where I was an Unseelie fairy or elfin creature of some sort. Today, I am more of a mix, leaning towards Seelie thoughts, towards humans, and my behaviors, I have actively transformed myself to show this. But let me tell you of a time that I remember when I carried so much anger and darkness inside towards humans. I remember hating them when they first arrived, as I saw them start to fill up the land with their stuff, their homes, their markets, and even huge temples and churches that destroyed the forest and plowed the land and made their city streets cut through my people's invisible homes, at least to them. They seemed like smelly and hairy creatures to me, since as a fairy I was almost hairless, with a bald head and long pointed ears. I was a greenish blue, the color of glow-in-the-dark mushrooms like Panellus stypticus, and I also glowed with a bioluminescence to my skin, and I believed that made me better than them, than humans who do not glow with a strange light within. Many of them were ugly to me, as I saw some of their hearts and how they treated each other, and their animals they farmed and used for food, and even how they would stomp around like unaware trolls or giants. I was only about 2 to 3 feet tall, after all, So the big people, as we call them, were much bigger, yet their brains seemed much smaller. I used to play tricks on them, stealing their horses in the middle of the night and letting them go free to run in the fields. I played many tricks and enchantments on them. Because humans have such heavy bodies, my soul ached for the poor horses, along with any other animals that they abused. And don't get me started on the wars and the violence men showed each other, and the silly religions that killed one another for. But I must not dwell in this place of darkness and anger for too long. And over many ages, I transformed myself. So today, I pose no threat. My transformation came as I met many brave and kind humans who showed me that they are not all bad. They were kind to nature and took in the nature wisdom teachings from the Druids that our people passed down to them, who lived in harmony with the forests and other elements. They were not prideful. They were willing to learn. And from these memories of life cycles and rebirths, I can understand how I am able to find beauty in all things now, including each human I meet. I see their darkness as well as their inner light. Spiritually, I too have evolved to understand that much destruction towards nature is done out of ignorance, a forgetful nature, that they themselves are nature itself. And if I truly want to see change of this, then education and healing is key, not revenge or punishment. So that's my story, going from Unseelie to Seelie. Now, I wanted to share with you a quote from a famous author. She is Morgan Daimler. She has her own YouTube channel, and we talk, we're friends. And I've had her on my channel a couple times for actually some interviews. And I asked her to give me her take on the Unseelie and the difference between what we would view as demons, because a lot of times demons and dark elves, dark fairies, they kind of get lumped together. So here's what Morgan said. I think sometimes some of these differences in terms are matters of human perception. Things get labeled dark or demon if they are antagonistic to humans, even if they have a good reason to be. And sometimes get these labels just because they prefer to be left alone. Like the Scottish Boaban Seath are labeled Unseelie because they kill men, which is true. But people ignore that the Seathi are said in some folklore to have legs like deer, and the men they kill are actually hunters. I think in many ways what we label as Seelie elves / fairies are the ones who see humans as worth helping, while the Unseelie see humans as dangerous or just another animal. So that was Morgan Daimler and her take on the Unseelie court, Dark Elves, Dark Fairies. So with that said, I wanted to show you what Tolkien thought about the darkness, and in terms of, so his elves were actually noted to be dark elves as well, but there's a difference in his interpretation because he was coming from the idea that they were not as dark as the human darkness could ever be, and that their darkness came from manipulation and becoming exiles from the land of light, which is Valinor. So by making the conscious choice to not go towards the light and to stay on Middle Earth, they became the Dark Elves. But they were not dark at all in mischievous or malevolent ways, as Brian Froud talks about some of the bad fairies, but they simply were dark because they did not go towards the light when they had a chance. But they were still kind, and they still did what they could to help others. But at the same time, they also had a nice mix within them where they didn't trust humans all the way to do the right thing. They also did not trust the dwarves too. And this is based on past experiences of watching and observing their behavior. So this is not a judgment that came from a biased place that was an assumption. This came from actually having experiences with humans and learning that many humans were on a quest for power and control. And the elves simply were never on a quest for power. They don't represent that in Tolkien's world. So I wanted to read to you what Tolkien had to say about this. And to understand it, we would probably have to talk about his myth of creation of Middle-earth that comes from the book The Silmarillion. So this is where he says this. The cycles begin with a cosmological myth, the music of the Ainur. God and the Valar, or powers, Englished as gods, are revealed. These latter are, as we should say, angelic powers, whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres of rule and government, not creation, making, or remaking. They are divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. Their power and wisdom is derived from their knowledge of the cosmogonical drama, which they perceived first as a drama. This is, as in a fashion we perceive a story composed by someone else, and later as reality. On the side of mere narrative device, this is, of course, meant to provide beings of the same order of beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology, which can yet be accepted, well, shall we say badly, by a mind that believes in the blessed Trinity. He's talking about himself. It moves then swiftly to the history of the elves, or the Silmarillion, to the world as we perceive it, but of course transfigured in a still half-mythical mode. That is, it deals with rational incarnate creatures of more or less comparable stature with our own. The knowledge of the creation drama was incomplete in each individual god, and incomplete if all the knowledge of the pantheon were pooled, for partly to redress the evil of the rebel Melkor, partly for the completion of all in the ultimate finesse of the detail. The Creator had not revealed all. The making and nature of the children of God, Eru, Iluvatar, had not, were the two chief secrets. All that the gods knew was that they would come at appointed times. The children of God are thus primarily related and akin and different as well, since also they are something wholly other to the gods, in the making of which the gods played no part. They are the object of the special desire and love of the gods. These are the firstborn, the elves, and the followers men. The doom of the elves is to be immortal, to love the beauty of the world, to bring it to full flower with their gifts of delicacy and perfection, to last while it lasts, never leaving it even when slain, but returning, and yet when the followers come to teach them and make way for them to fade as the followers grow and absorb the life from which both proceed. The doom or the gift of the men is mortality, freedom from the circles of the world, since the point of view of the whole cycle is the elvish. Mortality is not explained mythically. It is a mystery of God, of which no more is known than that what God has proposed for man is hidden, a grief and an envy to the immortal elves. As I say, the legendary Silmarillion is peculiar and differs from all similar things that I know, is not being pocentric. Its center of view and interest is not men, but elves. Men came inevitably after all. The author is a man, and if he has an audience, they will be men, and men must come into our tales as such, and not merely transfigured or partially represented as elves, dwarves, hobbits, etc. But they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, not principals. In cosmogony, there is a fall of angels, we should say, though quite different in form, of course, to that of Christian myth. These tales are new. They are not directly derived from other myths and legends, but they must inevitably contain a large measure of ancient widespread motives or elements. After all, I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. And long ago, certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear. There cannot be any story without a fall. All stories are ultimately about the fall, at least not for human minds as we know them and have them. So proceeding, the elves have a fall. Before their history can become storytal, the first fall of man, for reasons explained, nowhere appears. Men do not come on the stage until all that is long past, and there is only a rumor that for a while they fell under the domination of the enemy and that some repented. The main body of the tale, the Silmarillion proper, is about the fall of the most gifted kindred of the elves, their exile from Valinor, a kind of paradise, the home of the gods. In the further west, their re-entry into Middle-earth, the land of their birth, but long under the rule of the enemy, and their strife with them, the power of evil still visibly incarnate. It receives its name because the events are all threaded upon the fate and significance of the Silmarils, radiance of pure light, or primeval jewels. By the making of gems, the sub-creative function of the elves is chiefly symbolized, but the Silmarillion were more than just beautiful things as such. They were light. There was the light of Valinor made visible in the two trees of silver and gold, and these were slain by the enemy out of malice and hate. And Valinor was darkened, though from them, ere they died utterly, were derived the lights of sun and moon. A marked difference here between these legends and most others is that the sun is not a divine symbol, but a second best thing, and the light of the sun, the world under the sun, become terms for a fallen world and a dislocated, imperfect vision. But the chief artificer of the elves, Feanor, had imprisoned the light of Valinor in the three supreme jewels, the Silmarilli. Before the trees were sullied or slain, this light thus lived thereafter only in these gems. The fall of the elves comes about through the possessive attitude of Feanor and his 7 sons to these gems. They are captured by the enemy, set in his iron crown, and guarded in his impenetrable stronghold. The sons of Feanor take a terrible and blasphemous oath of enmity and vengeance against all or any, even of the gods, who dares to claim any part or right in the Silmarilli. They prevent the greater part of their kindred who rebel against the gods. And the Silmarilli, that's the plural name, I guess, just for the jewels of the Silmarillion, the story of the Silmarillion, who rebel against the gods and depart from paradise and go to make hopeless war upon the enemy. The first fruit of their fall is war in paradise, the slaying of elves by elves, and this and their evil oath dogs all their later heroism, generating treacheries and undoing all victories. The Silmarillion is the history of the war of the exiled elves against the enemy, which all takes place in the northwest of the world, Middle-earth. Several tales of victory and tragedy are caught up in it, but it ends with catastrophe and the passing of the ancient world, the world of the long first age. The jewels are recovered by the final intervention of the gods, only to be lost forever to the elves, one in the sea, one in the deeps of earth, and one is a star of heaven. This legendarium ends with a vision of the end of the world, its breaking and remaking, and the recovery of the Silmarilli and the light before the sun, after a final battle which owes, I suppose, more to the Norse version of Ragnarok than to anything else, though it is not much like it. Or is it Ragnarok? Yes, Ragnarok, than to anything else, though it is not much like it. So basically, the end, but not the end, a new beginning. So that was Tolkien's idea of the elves and what they represented as exiles from Valinor. Now, we know when we go into the character of Galadriel, the characters of Legolas and Elrond and Arwen and the elves in general, we can see that they were not dark spiritually as we would think of them. But because Tolkien wanted to add a little bit of his Christianity into the story, because they turned away from heaven in a way, then they were dark in that idea. But they themselves did not act dark or behave darkly. They had mistrust. They certainly kept to themselves, and they, were not naive in terms of they were able to see the darkness of man, and they were able to see the darkness of the other beings as well on earth. So that's why they kind of kept to their own realms until they were truly needed, and they knew that they had to do something, and that part of their moving on from Middle Earth was about helping and letting the humans take over. And as they faded away, as Tolkien said, that his story was always about humanity learning from the elves and then humans taking their place. And so that's why the elves eventually fade away, because it becomes mankind's time. So the elves kind of represent, the teachers, the guardians for a small time until they are ready and until they reach a sense of forgiveness inside, and they end up transforming, basically moving back into the light. Many of them do. We see Galadriel and Elrond and many of the elves get on that ship to the west, which symbolizes them spiritually moving on from the darkness of exile and now entering into Valinor, where they will be kind of redeemed and they become of the light once again. So that's Tolkien's take on the dark and the light. And this comes from his idea, his genuine idea that comes from his own letters that he wrote to his son and to many of the publishers in this book, that it comes from the idea that he never believed that anyone was irredeemable. And so he looked at human nature as well as the elven nature as something that was always in the process of evolving and transforming, and that you could take the darkest person on earth and there is some redeemable quality within them. It's really just about their choices and what they decide to do and how they decide to act. Everybody has light and dark within them, and it is about what side that you really bring out to the surface, and that creates your experiences. Whether it is more that it's surrounded by your darkness or is more surrounded by your light. It is a reflection of your light or it is a reflection of your darkness. So just keep that in mind, that that's kind of what Tolkien was talking about with his characters. Very different from the darkness of humans, which is more about wanting power and domination and control over others. So that is the difference. And yet we still see parallels to even how intuitives like Brian Froud and those who are folklorists and they understand fairy nature, there's a parallel there, that they're not as dark as the darkest humans, that they are mischievous or they have this type of behavior and of anger and resentment towards humans only because humans have kind of deserved it, really. And so it's really just a point of transformation when the fairy basically comes to understanding that they need to reach a sense of forgiveness within themselves. And that's kind of what took me through my transformation, and also acknowledging the darkness within and then wanting to change yourself for the better and have a new experience. This is from a book called Perilous and Fair, about all the women in Tolkien's stories. Very interesting book on lots of different essays and different types of research on Tolkien stories. And I just wanted to say this, that so it is said of Nienna that those who hearken to her learn pity and endurance and hope. So this is one of the key things that is so important to Tolkien, is the idea of forgiveness and pity. It is because of this Christian value of mercy and forgiveness as its central virtue that explains why this is so important to the redeeming of his elves and of the characters that are within his stories. That as soon as the elves kind of reach a sort of forgiveness or understanding of the humans and other beings, as well as kind of forgiving themselves too for the exile that has happened, that's when fully they can start moving on. Mercy and forgiveness is the transformation going from the dark to the light. And it is simply an active choice. And Nienna is the Valar. She's one of the gods of Middle Earth that you can call on to help you with that. And those that studied with her, like Gandalf, he learned basically how to take pity in others, and to have compassion. And so that is why he says those things later on to the other characters. He's teaching them about the compassion that is needed. And when Frodo says we should kill Gollum, Gollum is a wretched creature, Gandalf says to him, you should pity him, and that you cannot take a life and expect to be good as well. And so he's trying to teach him about the importance of compassion. And this comes from him studying with Nienna a long, long time ago. If you read the Silmarillion, it will go into it for you. So that's the perspective of Dark Elves on Tolkien. And we see the Dark Elf behavior. It's the Mirkwood Elves, where they don't want to talk to others. They actually imprison the dwarves. And we can see this in The Hobbit, which I will read you a little part here. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is a distrust of strangers. Though their magic was strong, even in those days they were wary. They differed from the high elves of the West and were more dangerous and less wise. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to Faerie in the West, or Valinor. Valinor and Faerie are the same. There the light elves, and the deep elves, and the sea elves went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things. Before some came back into the wide world, in the wide world the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered in the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still elves they were and remain, and that is good people. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood, on its eastern side, there lived at the time their greatest king. Before this huge doors of stone, a river ran out of the heights of the forest and flowed on and on into the marshes at the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened out on every side, wound far underground and had many passages and wide halls, but it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground and in the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees, and the king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they've accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was theirs due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the elf king had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems, and though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him, when they took their spell of him, and he came to his senses, and also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin when he was brought before him, and asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king Thranduil. "We did not attack them," answered Thorin. "We came to beg because we were starving." "Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?" "I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest." "What were you doing in the forest?" "Looking for food and drink because we were starving." "But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves with strong wooden doors, and left them. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins, and were reasonably well behaved, even to their worst enemies, when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things that they had no mercy upon. There in the king's dungeon, poor Thorin lay, and after he got over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to the next chapter and the beginning of another adventure in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness. So that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the Mirkwood, the Darker Elves' nature. They were still good people. They did not treat people unkindly, but they certainly were no friends to foes and to those that they deemed dangerous or to come into their territory unwanted. So Tolkien wanted to show that they were not as maybe benevolent as maybe the High Elves of Rivendell, or even Lothlorien, Galadriel at least. The guards of Lothlorien are different. The guards of Lothlorien also do act that way as well. So they are more protective. They are more the guardians in that way, but they certainly still have a kindness to them. And if you know how to get on their good side and you know how to be respectful, then you will not make them your enemy, basically. So that is the Dark Elves of Tolkien. Now, I wanted to go through some of these D&D cards that I found online Dungeons and Dragons is basically a way to experience the elven clans and tribes. If you get really into it, they kind of divide elves differently. So here is a type of dark elf called the Drow elf. So the Drow elf is one that usually has very, very dark skin, almost black midnight skin, very light hair, like silvery white hair. And the Drow's personality is very interesting. Here's the Drow's personality from the Forgotten Realms. Drow, by reputation, were almost entirely evil. The teachings of Loth represented the standard moral code for most of the race. They were overall decadent, but managed to hide it under a veneer of sophistication. Drow were arrogant, ambitious, sadistic, treacherous, and hedonistic. From birth, the Drow were taught they were superior to other races, and that they should crush those beneath them. Unlike inherently evil creatures like orcs, the evil of the Drow wasn't of inherent nature. They enforced the way of Loth, leading to a race of emotionally stunted people, with a tenuous grasp of sanity and scarred mentalities, among which relatively undamaged minds were considered abnormal. However, as mentioned above, the Drow had no innate drive towards evil, and their morality was colored by the society they lived in. The goals of the Drows was about increasing their station in life, as they desired the power on others that a higher station would provide. The scarcity of resources in the Underdark and the limited chances for advancement within the society forced most Drow to aggressively compete with each other. However, as mentioned above, they managed to hide their traits behind a veneer of sophistication. For example, while they liked to assassinate their competition, doing so and being exposed would bring punishment for being too overt about it, as would open murder. Rising through the ranks too quickly was dangerous for any Drow. The usual reaction was the formation of temporary alliances among those who were wronged by the quickly ascending Drow to take the ladder down. Such alliances were often successful. Drow were a violent race, and violence was their favorite, if not instinctive, method for conflict and resolution. The Drow managed to fight this urge when waiting for a more proposed time to strike. And the arrogance of the Drow is because the Drow believed themselves to be the apex creature. They were arrogant to the point of being incapable of viewing other creatures as their equal, including their own kind. Every single Drow believed themselves to be the best example of their superior species, and this attitude was condoned by some of their gods. The god of arrogance, Varun. The treatment reserved by the Drow to members of other races ran the entire gamut from pets to slaves to grudgingly respected partners when they proved themselves a military match for them, though never equals. As a general rule, Drow living with a Lothite society couldn't afford to show emotions like compassion or love, for they were easy to exploit. Their environment turned them into distrustful sadists with a constant readiness to backstab people, both in the figurative and literal sense, and Drow had a tendency to prefer emotional cruelty over physical ones. Cruelty was also seen as a mean of self-validation, and the Drow believed that any person that could not defend themselves deserved to be inflicted cruelty. And by delivering cruelty on a weaker creature, the Drow could prove their superiority. Hedonism. They loved and surrounded themselves with what they considered beautiful, generally without paying attention to the cost. They generally believed to be entitled to do whatever they wanted to do, and this also extended to partners. For example, they took and discarded lovers at their leisure and had a tendency to be very lecherous. The constant strife of their society led the Drow to be paranoid and fear everyone and everything, and they acted out in anger. They feared the potential loss of their station, the loss of Loth's favor, the loss of loyalty or outright rebellion of their underlings, and the potential punishment from their superiors. Drow were incapable of trusting other creatures, no matter their race. They were taught from an early age to be distrustful, as the Drow culture expected individuals to advance at the expenses of others by any means, including treachery and even outright murder. While the Drow understood the value of forging bonds, they did not see a value in the virtue of honesty. Forming bonds was thus a dangerous endeavor and mostly of temporary value. Since any alliance or cordial relationship could end in treachery, the Drow went into engagements of this sort expecting the worst. Alliances were generally formed when the ally was susceptible to blackmail, considered weak enough to not be a serious threat, or when cooperation were forced by the existence of a common enemy. Alliances were always under scrutiny for signs of treachery and often ended violently. In fact, the mere inconvenience of maintaining the bond could be a reason to end it. Vengefulness. Drow were vengeful people by necessity, not answering to slights with punishment, and was easily perceived as weakness by other Drow, and was essentially the same as inviting exploitation, abuse, or even death. For this reason, the goddess of vengeance had a significant appeal among the Drow. Good Drow. Good Drow amounted to about 15% of the entire race. However, most of them weren't actually of good alignment, but merely chaotic neutral or lawful neutral. Within the Lothite society, even actually good Drow generally had problems to form a sense of moral for themselves. They generally acted in the same way as evil Drow due to social pressure and risks. As mentioned above, being soft in any way was lethal in Drow society, and therefore these people often died. It was believed that the good Drow collectively worshipped Elistre, the goddess of freedom, but the actual breakdown was that the good-aligned Drow did indeed worship the kind goddess, while the morally neutral Drow's worship was split. Only truly exceptional good Drow were capable of freeing themselves from lost society. The majority was found out and sacrificed to Loth, and those who managed to leave Lothite settlements would often die to the dangerous wilderness of the Underdark. Among the actually good Drow, some followers of Elistre lived within Lothite settlements, and either looking for an escape with their families or as infiltrators helping the other Drow escape. They were known as secret moon dancers. However, no good Drow managed to cause meaningful, lasting, or any change for the matter in a Drow city. Furthermore, even those who escaped the cruelties of the Underdark found it more difficult to form long-term friendships than most races did, and had to constantly be on the lookout for pursuers who could kill them. And there you have it. So they were cunning, they were very smart, but they were also very distrustful. So that's one race of the Dark Elves that you have often heard about in D&D, and there is a couple cards that I was going to read you right here. So these are actual cards that I did find. So I'm going to read you a couple of these cards that you would place, and it kind of gives you an idea of their behavior. So one of the Dark Elves was called the Elf Archer, Thornbow Archer. Whenever Thornbow Archer attacks, each opponent who doesn't control an elf loses 1 life. And she says, I will not rest until the stench of eye blights is eradicated from these woods. So this gives you an idea that this type of archer was definitely the guardian of the forest. And she was tireless in her pursuit against enemies that would pose a threat to her people. So her darkness really comes out in the form of basically just a guardian, and she's going to attack anyone who is going to attack her. Next one is called the Eye Blight Assassin. So when an Eye Blight assassin enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -1 until end of turn. And it says this, Bogart blood disgusts me almost as much as the foul creatures themselves. So you could see like there's like this angriness in this character. And she's got like a knife in her hand and she's like wiping it clean. Doesn't care who she kills because she just sees these creatures with such disgust and she doesn't want them in her forest any longer. This is the next one, the Dark Sorceress, Dark Elf Sorceress. Reduce the cost to play this unit by 1 for each corrupted unit controlled by your opponents. She speaks to the shadows, and they answer her every call. So that card is a powerful one. And then here's another type of Dark Elf. And this is Marathi, and this is like a kind of like a half, maybe ram type of creature, an elf, and it says the action is spend 2 resources to choose a target unit, and that unit loses all power until the end of the turn. And she says, I shivered at the sight of her. Actually, this is somebody speaking about her. I shivered at the sight of her beauty far beyond that of mortal man. But her soul glowed with an inner darkness that chilled my very core. Imperial soldier who saw her. And this one is a Savinian elf. Purity of magic can only come from the purity of the land. How can a meal nourish if the ingredients are spoiled? Sedani of Savini. So she is one of the elves that is talking about the corruption of her land. So she's saying that her purity of her magic has been affected because humans have affected the land or other creatures have affected her land. So once again, you see this nature guardianship and this anger and this resentment that is coming from destruction of nature. And then here's another one, Elves of the Deep Shadow. They are aberrations who have turned on everything we hold sacred. Let them be cast out. Ahin, the Speaker of the Council. And she's talking about the people that basically have destroyed the lands. Let them be cast off, of the earth. So you don't want to mess with Dark Elves because they are the ones that are very angry at humans about their destruction of nature as well as other creatures too. Now here's the difference between a mystical elf. So here's a night elf and here's a mystical elf, or dark elf, dark night elf, and a mystical elf. The dark night elf in the D&D card is the spellcaster effect. Inflict 500 points of direct damage during your emphasis for each dark monster on your side of the field. So you have control over dark forces. You can use dark creatures, the forces of nature destruction in your power to hurt your enemies. And here's the difference between a mystical light elf. This is it. The spellcaster card is a delicate elf that lacks offense, but has a terrific defense backed by mystical power. Now you can see the difference. The Dark Elves, they represent the aggressive nature, the guardianship over nature in an aggressive way. And they are on the offense. And the Light Elves are on the defense. They will not attack aggressively. They will defend, and they think about their consequences if they take another life. Whereas the Dark Elves don't think about the consequences of taking other lives because to them, they are in the right because they view themselves as being the superior ones, and also that the other ones were wrong and that they are somehow the punishers. So it's similar to the idea of demons, if we want to think about it that way, because demons in Christianity and in other religions have also symbolized the punishers of humans. So we have the elemental punishers of humans that are represented in the Dark Elves. And demons are not elementals. Sometimes they're represented by animal heads, and they kind of sometimes are represented if you go into studying demonology, but they're not elementals. They're not really in charge of the forest as the elves are or the other fairies. So I hope that they give you a little bit of clarity today in what the difference is in terms of the aggressive nature of the Dark Elves. They do have good in them. Every every creature has both good and light. It is about trying to understand what makes them so angry, what makes them so revengeful and want to punish humanity. So you really have to get on their good side about that. I want to talk about the beauty of darkness, because I identify as a moon elf. You know, if I had to identify myself, I'm not a sun elf. I love the night. I am particular about the moonlight versus the sunlight. I think better at night. I feel more energized at night. I love all things of the night in terms of, I love the darkness. I love the reflection. I love how quiet the streets are. I love how everybody pretty much is in bed unless they're a night owl and they're out and they're socializing. I love what the night symbolizes. So I myself am like a night elf. And whenever I play any kind of games, like when I used to play World of Warcraft, I was always a night elf. I was never a blood elf. I was a night elf. And yet the night elves are on the side of the alliance. They're the good side. They're not the horde, which is against the humans and are trying to attack. So you had the night elves that are on the side of humans. So you have a nice division in terms of the darker realms. That darkness, it can symbolize spiritually being dark. It can symbolize darker emotions such as anger and revenge and hate and all those things that sometimes we feel. But there are night elves and moon elves that are gentle and are good, but they also represent the beauty of darkness and whatever that means to you. There's poetry to the moonlight and to darkness to some of us that really like it. If you think about the fireflies that come out at night, all the glowing things, the glowing mushrooms, the glowing fireflies, the moonlight, the dancing sprites and fairies in the moonlight. This is an image that has been kind of ingrained in a lot of different types of fairy tales. I have one right here this is called the Elves and Fae, the Giant Golden Book of Elves and Fairies by Jane Warner, and a couple different people basically put this all together, selected by Jane Warner, I should say. This is one of the poems about the moon fairies. When a Ring's Around the Moon by Mary Jane Carr, the wee folk will be tripping in their silver dancing shoon, ring around the meadow when a ring's around the moon. Curtsy to the right and left and curtsy to the middle, the fiddler will be fiddling on his tiny fairy fiddle. In and out and round about, a magic circle making, the pipers will be piping till their tiny throats are aching. Oh, few may watch the wee ones dance, for fairy guards are spying, and down beneath the grasses, all the dancers will be hieing. But hearken well, what time you see, a ring around the moon, and you will hear the music of the wee folks' dancing tune. So that just gives you a little bit of the image of the moonlight fairies that are not necessarily dark in terms of how they view humans or in the way that they act and their behaviors towards others, but they prefer the darkness. It's just their time to come out and be alive. I wanted to read to you one last thing. It is a story about a transformation of a creature that basically was thought to be at first a demon and then transformed into an elf. And this is how. So there's like a lesson in this. It's called A Goblin Maid by Florence Page Jacques. A green hobgoblin, small but quick, went out walking with a blackthorn stick. He was full of mischief, full of glee. He frightened all that he could see. He saw a little maiden in a wood, and he looked as fierce as a goblin should. He crept by the hedgerow, and he said, "Boo, boo," laughed the little girl. "How are you?" "What?" said the goblin. "Aren't you afraid?" "I think you're funny," said the maid. "Ha," said the goblin, sitting down flat. "You think I'm funny? I don't like that." "I'm very frightening. You should flee." "You're cunning," she said, "as you can be." Then she laughed again and went away, but the goblin stood there all that day. A beetle came by and, well, it said, but the goblin only shook his head. For I am funny, he said to it. I thought I was alarming, and I'm not a bit. If I'm amusing, he said to himself, I won't be a goblin, I'll be an elf. For a goblin must be a goblin all the day, but an elf need only dance and play. So the little green goblin became an elf, and he dances all day, and he likes himself. So that shows you kind of the transformation that happens from going from a demon or a goblin that wants to scare and cause mischief, and then becomes an elf. And of course, we know that there are dark elves, but this is the transformation to the light side. The Seelie court, the Seelie word actually means silly and lighthearted and free, and Unseelie is more serious. Unseelie. Unseelie. That's literally what the Unseelie court means. So let's go to the comments and chat. How about that? Oh my goodness, I'm a poet now. Can't stop my rhyming. Teresa Warren, I love this past life memory. Thank you for sharing. I'm an incarnated dragon. You're welcome. I'm glad I did. Well, I think it will just help people kind of understand the Unseelie mind, that it's not unfocused hatred of humans. It is because we've watched, I shouldn't say we, I'm not part of that anymore, but it's because the Unseelie, just the fairies in general, have watched humans' behaviors and have watched how they've treated animals and each other. So I really wanted to get that point across and show there's a reason, there's a mirror behind the idea of dark fairies and dark elves. Fae Wildwood, those wouldn't have been good traits if they were properly cultivated. Those would have been right. Anything that is higher on the food chain than humans is called a monster. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like, that's a very dark elf thing to say, because having the hatred and the disgust towards humans, it can be seen as a powerful weapon against them too. So yes, to dark elves, you would want to carry that, you know, because it's like, that's what makes you a powerful warrior and a guardian, you know, against the ignorance of humans. But yeah, I've learned over time that there's a real spiritual truth in, like I said, understanding that if you ever want to see change and you don't want to keep on going on the merry-go-round where you have this revenge and hatred and set to punish others, then the key is education and healing. And honestly, that's how we all enjoy life more. Because revenge and punishment only keep that merry-go-round going in this world. It keeps the wars going, basically. Noreen, mega Unseelie here, but I'm also a positive wood elf. Well, you can explain how that combination works for you. Charkai Ko, I believe the Slytherins are the ones who've been suffering the most to come out with positive impact. Oh, are you talking about Harry Potter? I was just watching Harry Potter. Yeah, the Slytherins, I think that they could be kind of likened to the idea of dark elves, because yes, they have that cunning and they have kind of this arrogance with them, and they're not all bad and they're not all good, but it's about kind of what side they decide to use. And like I said, if you know how to kind of get on the good side of the Slytherin, and you know, you give them respect and things like that, it's the same thing with dark elves. If you know how to get on the good side, you show respect, show kindness to nature, show that you're not a stupid human, then they will not be your enemy, basically. Although Slytherins don't like muggles in general. You know, that's just it. Slytherins are usually against all humans because don't they come from a pure bloodline? So, I mean, you have that. Fae Wildwood, I see nothing at all wrong with the Unseelie court. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a matter of being wrong or right, because like the Brian Froud even said, "Oh no, I'm frozen." Can you see me? Oh, am I frozen, everybody? Okay, well, I'm gonna have to end this. I am totally frozen. I don't know. I don't know if you're still there. I finally got a chance to reboot everything. So hopefully that worked out. You still there? Can you see me? Well, that was fun. Okay. Well, anyway, I think we spoke a lot about everything. Just go ahead and put your own story and comments down below. And hopefully you can leave your comments and okay, there you are. Good. Okay. There's some people still left. So that's great. Like I said in my comment below, yeah, I probably gave too much away, talking too much about the Unseelie court and fairies. They don't like that too much. But hopefully now you know how you can also transform your own kind of anger within yourself, and also be able to have a relationship with those that seem to carry that kind of anger towards humans. So you just have to understand what they really mean when you read about them in folklore and in the tales about how they soured milk and they've done different things to trick and kind of manipulate. And that is simply because the ignorance of humans provided a chance for the darker fairies to teach them a lesson. So I'll leave that, and we can always probably do another one of these videos once again. So everyone have a wonderful night, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.